Let's talk about character writing. I made a really venomous video about the character writing in Baldur's Gate 3, so let's make a less venomous general-purpose character writing video. This is it. Obviously, it's just going to be my opinions, since it's my video, but with that in mind, let's talk. Here are 4 characters. Which of these has the best design? You probably have strong opinions. Which of these is written best? You probably have strong opinions on that too. Which of them has the best design from a writer's perspective? That's a little bit of a strange question. It's not a question that gets brought up a whole lot. If you try and look it up online, you're going to find a lot of checklist advice. Oh, make them have conflicting opinions, give them nuanced backstories and wants, and all that jazz. I don't like checklists. People follow checklists and they check the boxes off and then they think that they're now a good writer. Well, you know what? These 2 characters do not have that checklist filled out. This character does. Guess which of these 3 characters is worst? The checklist is not writing. So what's going on? The simple fact is that your narrative is the only thing that exists. The nuanced, complex backstory that you give your character only exists if it shows up in the narrative, either in full force or as hints. So what you're doing when you give your characters traits, as a writer, is you're giving yourself tools to use them in the narrative. These traits only matter in the narrative, because the narrative is the only thing that exists. With that in mind, you can see that while these characters do not have every possible trait that a character design checklist wants them to have, the traits they do have are actually used. Whereas this lady has all the traits, and they're not used very well at all. What traits you can use will depend on your skill as a writer and your instincts. So what character design is good for you will depend on the kinds of traits you instinctively know how to use in your writing, or you can figure out how to use by agonizing over it. For example, Garrus doesn't really have a complex, nuanced backstory. Not until you've finished all 3 games, at which point the games are his complex, nuanced backstory. At the beginning, he's just a cop that's fed up with criminals getting away with things. The trait he has that the writers actually use is the fact that he is a perfect echo of the player's own journey. So as the player advances in their narrative, we get to hear Garrus's narrative echo the player's personal journey. That allows the writers to add richness to both sides of that equation. On the other hand, we've got Morrigan. Morrigan has that complex backstory, and her role is not to echo the player or anything like that. She is here to just pull the player full force into this weird fantasy world. They want you to enter into this slightly darker, witchier fantasy than you have been before you meet Morrigan. She's a witch lady that lives in the swamp with a creepy old crone that may or may not be her mother, and maybe she needs rescuing, or maybe she doesn't. That nuance allows the writers to build the atmosphere of this arc of the game so that the player can feel that richness of experience. They're never quite sure whether they can trust Morrigan, but that's kind of the point. These are traits that the writers know how to use, so they are traits that are valuable. If the writers didn't know how to use the traits, then they wouldn't show up very well, and even if they existed, their final end impact would be very, very weak. Now, the problem with thinking like this is that you can tend to get locked in on the 1 or 2 things you think you can use in your story. Like, you might think that the only thing you really need is characters that can advance the narrative by dint of being part of the narrative and basically forcing it along as part of their character. Or you might get into the problem where you think that the only thing they need is to resonate with the player's journey. Or you might get into the idea that the only thing they need is to resonate with the world and help communicate the world to the player. And I mean, those are all valuable. But the point of the checklists is to shake things up enough that you realize that you can use these other kinds of traits in your writing. They're not a replacement for good writing. They're a way to help you set up a character that will accidentally make you into a good writer when you realize that you can use these traits in your writing. So at the end of the day, a good character design from a writing perspective is a character whose traits you can use to craft your narrative better. You want a better narrative, and your characters can help you with that. They can make it move easier, they can make it flow more naturally, they can make it have more depth or more nuance or more emotional investment. There are lots of ways that you can use these characters to change the tone or manipulate the exact feelings that the player has, or any number of other things. You can even just use them to pump up the tension or ratchet the tension down, depending on what you need. And that's why those traits exist. Character traits exist to help you do those things. Just having them is pointless. You need to actually use them. That's it.